Hi, I'm Richard Vague with Tychos. While we've been absorbed in the U.S. election and its aftermath, our friends in France have been having some political turmoil of their own. Its Prime Minister, Michel Barnier, resigned on Thursday after far-right and leftist lawmakers joined forces to topple his government only 3 months after he took office. His government was the first to fall from a no-confidence vote in France in more than 60 years and made him the shortest-serving prime minister in modern French history. It all stems from the fact that the French political parties are split into 3 roughly equal parties or factions, left, center, and right, all of which are not inclined to make life easy on each other for this foreseeable future. The immediate issue was Barnier's attempt to reduce France's government deficit, always a fraud exercise, from about 6% of GDP to about 4% through a combination of spending cuts and tax increases. I'll leave it to others to cover all the many issues and large personalities, which include President Macron's now seemingly failed attempt at assuming the unofficial leadership of Europe, Marine Le Pen's long-standing far-right assault on Macron, the fact that expenditures on Ukraine make the whole thing much more difficult, the embarrassment of seeing its borrowing costs briefly exceed those of prodigal Greece, and the further embarrassment of it all happening just as the Cathedral of Notre Dame saw its spectacular reopening. This political upheaval comes as France is experiencing poor economic growth. Like much of Europe, it has yet to regain its pre-pandemic growth rate. So let's look quickly at the economics behind it all. First, France has been running these large deficits of 5 to 6% of GDP for well over a decade, ever since the global financial crisis. And during that time, with those deficits, it's seen its government debt to GDP ratio grow from 70% in 2008 to 112% today. Second, since 2005, France has had a trade deficit in all but 2 years, the very opposite of their neighbor Germany's long-standing trade surplus. That trade deficit leaves them more vulnerable to other sources of adversity. And third, while they saw their private sector loans increase in ratio to GDP in the 2010s, bringing respectable GDP growth, which at one point actually touched 3%, they overdid it a bit, especially in residential lending, and they now have the unusual and problematic situation of private sector loans actually declining. We often see private sector loan growth slowing after a period of excess, but here they are actually down, which is much more rare. So their economy needs to absorb its modest excess, and as it does, private sector lending growth can and should resume. Going back to basics, GDP growth is a function of 3 things: growth in private sector spending, plus growth in public sector spending, plus the trade balance. And private sector spending is a function of private sector debt growth. And public sector spending is a function of public sector debt growth. That means GDP growth is a function of private sector debt growth plus public sector debt growth plus the trade balance. It's pretty much that straightforward. And in France, 2 of those 3 things are going the wrong way. Private sector loans are shrinking, and the trade balance remains negative, so the only real source of growth that they have seen has been the growth in government debt, with the result, since only one of the 3 is really hitting, that growth has been modest and lackluster. So what's the best way to get out of the trap of over-reliance on government debt growth? Simple: more robust private sector debt growth. As we said, their economy needs to absorb its modest excess And as it does, private sector lending will resume, meaning spending will perk up and government tax revenues will pick up. As an aside, if there's a solution on the Ukraine situation, that will take at least some pressure off the budget. Of course, France also needs to pay attention to its trade deficit, but that's difficult within the strictures of the EU, so we don't expect much change there. So that's the economic story, but none of that speaks to the social and cultural issues that have resulted in such a divided government. It's a political crisis more than a genuine economic crisis. So with those cultural and social differences, look for France's political difficulties to remain with it for a while. That's it for this week. Thanks.